Hello everybody. Today's video is a little bit late. A lot of technical difficulties. My keyboard is currently out of commission and I'm filming from my phone, so yeah. Anyway, today's video is about intervals. Now, intervals are one of the things in gospel music that is really contentious because people have a tendency to use enharmonic notes where they're inappropriate. Sometimes some people may say that a song is in C sharp, whereas the music actually says it's in D flat. People say, well, it's the same thing. Well, it's not necessarily the same thing, but I'm not going to get into that today. Now, starting with intervals, something that I touched on briefly in a previous video, we're going to start with reading in general, basic things about the staff and reading music. So this is the treble clef, or the G clef. This is the bass clef. Together they form the grand staff. We've already covered this in a previous video, so this is all the redundancy you're going to get. The next thing that you see here, you have a 4 on top of a 4. That's called the time signature. The time signature tells you how many beats per measure and what kind of note counts as one beat. So, the top number tells you how many beats are in the measure. How many beats. The bottom number tells you what kind of note counts as one beat. Now, for simplicity's sake, I've written this in advance to show you the value of notes. As you can see here, there's 4 beats in the measure, and every quarter note counts as one beat. The top number tells you how many beats per measure. The bottom number tells you what kind of note. For your own reference, a 4 means a quarter note counts as one beat. If the bottom number were 2, that would mean a half note counts as one beat. And if the bottom note were an 8, that would mean that an eighth note counts as one beat. Okay, so if this were 4/8, then these 4 eighth notes would be one measure. Since it's 4/4, these 4 quarter notes count as one measure. If this were 4/2, then there would have to be 4 half notes to equal one measure. You may have guessed it, but this would be a 1. So for 4/1, you would need 4 whole notes. So whole note, half note, quarter note, and eighth note. Now down here we have 16th notes. Forgive the blurriness. 16th notes, you may have guessed, there are 16 in a measure. 4, 8, 12, and 16. Eighth notes, you have 8 in a measure. 4 and 8. Quarter notes, divide the measure up into quarters. 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%. Just like a dollar. Quarter, 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 quarter. Half note, divides the measure in half, and a whole note in this 4/4 time takes up the whole measure. Now, that's just the value of these notes going down to 16th. But how do we use them? You may have recognized this. Since this video is about intervals, we're going to get into intervals. I'm using quarter notes now. So we have this note, which is middle C, which is the same as this note. These two are the same pitch. Exact same pitch. Same thing. So we're starting on middle C. We have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. That's your C major scale. Now, in your C major scale, each note that you have written here would get what's called a scale degree, which is a classification of the pitch that sounds when you play the note in reference to the scale. So, C being the first note, first scale degree, the first note of the scale gets the first scale degree. The second note of the scale gets the second scale degree, and so on. So the first scale degree is 1, second's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So why does that matter? This is why it matters. The scale degree determines what the interval is called. Now, an interval is the relationship between two keys, or how two keys interact, or two notes or two pitches interact. I should say notes, how two notes interact. So, the first interval you're going to learn here is what's called a perfect prime, or a perfect unison, or unison. All four names, the same thing. Two pitches that sound the same. Two separate pitches. Imagine this as two people singing the same pitch. One person singing this one person singing this one. They will sound exactly the same. Well, not two people, because if two people are, that's beside the point. There's two voices singing the same pitch. That would be called a unison. Now, the point to make here is that a lot of times people talk about unison and they're singing an octave apart. It's not the same as a perfect unison. That's called an octave unison. This is what choirs do when the basses or tenors sing an octave lower than the sopranos and altos. So that there's a difference there, but it is still the same pitch, so technically it's a unison, but they're not the same thing as a perfect unison. Moving on, you have the first and second scale degree. So, since we're basing all of our intervals off the first scale degree, we're going to name them for the second one. So, this will be called a second. You have a first and a second scale degree, so it's called a second. Second interval is from a line to a space or a space to a line. Either one works, as long as they're directly adjacent to each other. C to D would be a second, so would D to F, D to E, E to F, F to G, and so on, as long as they're right next to each other. These are your other intervals. This is a third, goes from a line to a line, or a space to a space, as you'll see shortly. Should have done this earlier, but space, I did it wrong. Space to a space. That would be a third. Both of those are thirds. Next, you have a fourth. A space to a line or a line to a space, but not directly adjacent to each other. So this one would be from C to F, or D to G, as long as, and E to A. You see what's happening? F to B. I'm going from the first note that I chose past the second, third, and fourth scale degree. But past the second and third, ending on the fourth. So I'm skipping two scale degrees. Now the next one, C to G, would be a fifth. Next, you have C to A, which is a sixth. Hoping some of you are seeing the pattern here. You have C to B, which is a seventh. And you have C to C, which is an octave. Now, I mentioned the pattern a few seconds ago. The pattern is this. If it is an even numbered interval, the two notes that are sounded together will always be a line to a space or a space to a line. If it is an odd-numbered interval, they will both be on lines or they will both be on spaces. The reason why this is important is because every chord that you build is a stack of thirds, essentially. Every chord that you play is a stack of thirds. But this is not the chord video, this is strictly for intervals. So, let's continue. Now you have your intervals. Your intervals are there, right in front of you. So when we talk about intervals, you have major and minor intervals. Major interval is just what you see in front of you, as they are in the major scale. However, these are not all called major intervals. There are a few intervals I'm not going to get into it now, but I may do a video in the future on the harmonic series, and I'll be able to tell you more about that. But for now, please just go along with this. So the first interval is a perfect unison. The second interval is called a major second. This is major third. The fourth is called a perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, perfect eighth, or octave. Now 1, 4, and 5 are perfect intervals. 1, 4, 5, and 8 are perfect intervals. All the other intervals are major. So perfect, major, major, perfect, perfect, major, major, perfect. Perfect unison or unison, major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, and octave or eighth, perfect eighth. Now, getting into minor intervals. Minor intervals change. If you take a major interval and make it smaller, it becomes minor. What do I mean by smaller? You take the interval and you decrease the size of the interval. Not C to E anymore, but C to E flat would be a minor third. Not a major, it's still a third because you're going from a C, some type of C, to some type of E. However, the E is lowered, so it's decreasing the size of the interval by a half step, making it not major, but minor. Now, the same thing happens when you increase the size of the lower interval, lower note. So if you have C sharp and E, the interval is still smaller than a third, much smaller than a major third. You made it smaller by a half step. So that is still a minor third. So that looks interesting, but go with it for now. Next, you have the perfect intervals. Perfect intervals, when you make them smaller, they don't become minor, they become diminished. So if you have a C and a G flat, go back. If you have a C and a G flat, you'll have a diminished fifth. If you have a C and a F sharp, you will have an augmented fourth. This is what happens when you increase the size of a perfect interval. They become augmented. So, some of you may already know this, but if you take a C and an F, and you lower the F by a half step, you see what happens? It doesn't become an E. It becomes an F flat. This is the distinction that you have to make. Otherwise, you are going to be wrong whenever you spell chords. Whenever you spell a chord, you are going to be incorrect unless you make this distinction. If it's not a fourth, if it's the distance of a fourth, you cannot call it a third. The distance here is 1, 2, 3, 4. So it has to be some kind of fourth. You can't say it's third, even though you are playing the key C and E. That is incorrect because that is F flat. It'll sound like a C and an E, but you'll be wrong. So rather than having you being wrong, I'm going to give you the correct information. So please go with that. Use that from now on. All right. Same. That's major intervals, perfect intervals. Major intervals, when you make them bigger, any major or perfect interval, if you make them larger, are considered to be augmented. So this would be an augmented sixth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. As your augmented sixth. The same thing here. If I make the interval bigger, instead of lowering the top note, I lower the bottom. Instead of raising the top note, I'm going to lower the bottom note. I create an augmented sixth. Intervals, to accurately classify them and to get them right every time, you have to count the distance between the keys. Distance between the pitches, distance between the notes. That's how you get it right every time. What do I mean by distance? Count the half steps. How many half steps does it take to get from one key to the next on your keyboard or on your instrument or when you sing it? Or just count them. You have C. C to C isn't anything, so 0. C to C sharp is 1. C to D is 2. C to E or E flat or D sharp is 3. C to E is 4. C to F is 5. And so on and so on, just counting up. If you count the distance between, it doesn't matter if it has a sharp or a flat on it. If the number is the same, that's the type of interval it is. So that is all the time that I have right now. This video is long. Well, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll try to make the videos under 10 minutes from now on. All right, bye.